The CBC has paused its activity on Twitter after being labeled government-funded media by the platform. According to Twitter, the label means the organization may have varying degrees of government involvement over editorial content, which is not the case at the CBC. The label is something Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre pushed for in a letter to the company last week and has sparked new focus on the Conservatives' push to defund the CBC.
With the CBC has brought him to involve American tech giants to try and attack the local news, the local culture, the francophone news that Canadians rely on from coast to coast to coast.
All right, the power panel is with me for one last round. Carleen, James, Andrew, and Shachi, and maybe one last round entirely, depending on how this goes. So, James, this is a fraught one for me, but look, you were a heritage minister, so you had ministerial responsibility for the CBC. What's your take on this whole push by Pierre Poilievre to defund it? Is this, I think he's more sincere than probably any Conservative leader in my lifetime. What's your sense?
We are past due to have a serious conversation in this country about the public broadcaster. The last time the CBC and the Broadcast Act was amended was back in 1991. Before that, it was in 1968 because of the Fowler report that came a couple years prior to that. But we've essentially kicked the can down the road on, the big question, which is, do we need to have a public broadcaster, yes or no? If the answer is yes, then what should it do and what should it not do? And then question three is, how much are we prepared to pay for it? And successive governments, majority, minority, red and blue both, have avoided this question. And now we've sort of devolved into this sort of mud throwing back and forward, where Justin Trudeau sort of is essentially going to the ground of, you're not Canadian if you don't support the CBC in its current iteration. I don't think that's where this conversation needs to go. I don't think this is a top priority issue for Canadians, but I think it's a responsible debate that needs to happen with Canada's highest profile public, one of our most high profile public institutions in the country. So let the debate begin, and I hope it doesn't go down the road of just pure ugliness for its own sake, but rather to have an important conversation about historically what's been an important institution for Canadians telling stories to each other with news information, broadcasting in Indigenous languages, the protection of the French fact in media outside of the province of Quebec. Can those things be done in the private sector, yes or no? I think we're due to have a conversation about it.
Carleen, the conversation James lays out sounds like a very important conversation to have. I'm not sure that's the conversation we're having. I mean, where do you think this is going politically?
What James described sounds like a very reasonable conversation, yeah. And indeed, I'm not sure that's what we're seeing. I mean, let me just first say, as someone who grew up in a fairly remote rural community in Canada, I think those are the kinds of people who understand exactly how important the CBC can be, where for many of us, it was our only source of news and contact with the world on a daily basis when you fired up your AM radio. And I think it would be a mistake to underestimate the number of Canadians that feel that way. But I think the real thing here, David, is that this conversation, since it began late last week, has never really been about the CBC. It's been about Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives looking for the newest thing that they can grab onto to galvanize their base, to raise some money through their fundraising, and honestly, that's about it. Having been involved in 5 or 6 federal election campaigns now with the Liberal Party of Canada, I can tell you every single one of those campaigns, somebody, an activist on one or both sides would convince me, this is the year, the CBC and funding it or not is going to be the election decider issue. It never really is, because the truth is Canadians have concerns about a lot more things going on. And when we're in the middle of an affordability crisis, a kind of geopolitical mess going on over in Europe, I don't think that this debate that is so fervent in Ottawa is really resonating with the average Canadian across the country.
Well, Shachi, what do the numbers tell us on this? Like, what is the public appetite for defunding, for supporting? Is it a political winner, or is it just fundraising juice for the base on both sides of the argument?
It's interesting because the last time we asked about this, we specifically focused on testing among would-be Conservative voters during the last leadership election of the Conservatives, and said, okay, you've said that you would consider voting CPC. Here's a bunch of things that the contenders have promised to do. What do you make of some of these ideas? Indeed, 64% of that Conservative voting universe said that they would support and were enthusiastic about the potential of defunding the CBC. And of course, that's Pierre Poilievre's language, the defunding. So we didn't ask about trimming back the budget or looking at the mandate. It's specifically defund. Now that has been misreported falsely by outlets such as True North Media. That data point by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute at one point had done it, republished in the Hub, and by Polling Canada saying that 64% of Canadians were in favor of defunding the CBC. That math is not true. It never was true. It doesn't exist. And that is in part because this is so politicized. So for every bit of protein on the plate that this conversation lends to the Poilievre conservative base, and I make the distinction, it is very much the Poilievre conservative base, you still have people, whether they have sent their $20 to the Friends of the CBC, I don't even know if that organization still exists, or simply are quite aghast at what they're seeing. Now, I want to go back to what James was saying about the need for a conversation about this institution as a public broadcaster. These are political debates, and the broadcasters can get thrown back and forth like a political football. Look at what's happening in the United Kingdom at the moment around the BBC and others. But I do fear that we're actually too far down the road in terms of how hyper-politicized this has become to actually have a grown-up conversation about what the CBC does well and, perhaps what it does not do very well at all.
Andrew, where would you like to see this conversation go?
Yeah, look, there's a school of thought that certainly says it's been all downhill since the Beachcombers got canceled. And, that kind of sense of the CBC as part of our national identity has kind of drifted off in the decades that have come since. What I think is worrying is that the debate has moved from, what has been a perennial debate, should CBC be competing for advertising revenue on its main channels, what's its role in terms of driving Canadian culture versus American programming, how much should it be spending on sports promotion. All of that's now drifted over into something that I think is much more worrisome, and that is this conversation about whether there is actual editorial bias on the news channels. I think it would be unfair to say that that has not been a concern. Certainly, I know within within the NDP, no doubt within the Conservatives, that there is a school of thought that the CBC is biased towards the Liberals' point of view, maybe not in a big L way, but certainly has that central Canadian Laurentian elite kind of perspective, and that it does tend to cloud the way it covers a lot of the issues. Is it done in a way that is consciously so to try and manipulate public opinion? I don't believe that at all. Is it becoming more of an issue in part because the media personalities are expected to do more punditry? Is it because they're being more open about what they're thinking on social media platforms like Twitter that's allowing the public and those who have that point of view of concern to build a case that says there is a bias here? I don't know how we start to guard against that, but I do know that the Canadians are much better served with the way that our broadcast media, both public and private, operate than what we've seen in the United States, where it is, if you're a Republican, you watch one channel. If you're a Democrat, you watch a different one. At least we have the opportunity to have all of the channels still available to all Canadians.
So James, just to bring it home, I guess, interestingly, you mentioned Laurentian elite. I had someone on Twitter accusing me of that, and I was like, I'm from St. John's. Trust me, I did not grow up in that Laurentian elite world. But James, how do we get to that conversation that you started us off with, that you think is the one that the CBC should have? And I think a lot of people who work for the CBC agree that that is a healthy conversation to have about an institution that has played a big role in the country's history. How do we get to that conversation?
I don't know that we will, at least not in the immediate term, because the hyperbolic rhetoric on both sides of it, and that's just frankly kind of the nature of it. But the other thing too that I worry about, frankly, as a conservative, is that the CBC is 1/3 of 1% of the federal government's budget. In the recent federal budget, the government of Canada announced $80 billion in infrastructure spending. So this is 1/80th of that amount of money, and it risks being a massively divisive issue. across this country on a lot of fronts that would be not helpful for a Conservative government that's got a lot of things it would have to do should it form government in the near future. So, and second thing is Brian Mulroney reminds us that the number one obligation of any prime minister in this country is national unity. And if you put the lens on that, the public broadcaster historically, whether it is now or it will be in the future, but historically has been the physical institution and the physical representation of Canada's commitment to arts, to culture, to official languages across this country, and as a physical institution for Quebec to recognize that the French language is being respected in all parts of Canada beyond Quebec. Therefore, they do have a home within Canada. So and then you add on the Indigenous component of it with 8 Aboriginal languages in the North, and the fact that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission talks about public broadcasting. For $1 billion, which is a lot of money, in the macro, I worry that this would be a massive distraction for a government that's going to have a lot on its plate should Pierre Poilievre become prime minister.
Look, I want to thank you, gang, for a good, civil, sensible conversation about the future of the CBC right here on the CBC. I appreciate that. James Moore, Shachi Carroll, Andrew Thompson, and Caroline Verine. Thanks, gang. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks.